Greetings all, BWS2K here, riding on the back of my previous video where I did sort of the random generation for a hack. I wanted to take some time and go over a Google Doc that I've been sort of building and writing for several months now, just with a lot of the sort of basic Cortex theory that I use and apply and think about when I'm designing something. Others may do it differently. This is not a definitive case for anything. It's just that there are some questions that come up a lot, and these are sort of my common answers to them. If you're playing a game with me, I may have sent you this video specifically to take a look at something, but at any rate, this is kind of the general behind-the-scenes machinations when I'm thinking of, do I choose this mod, do I choose this set, how do I present this, do I need to model this, and so on. So I'm just going to read through it. It's a pretty quick read, and then you know, if there are any questions, and you can ask them in the comments, or you can ask them on the Discord, and we can do a follow-up video if we need to. But I just thought I'd share them here. So the first thing, and I think probably for me the bedrock of everything that it all builds on, is that all traits, PC traits, GMC traits, complications, assets, all traits are a way of measuring narrative impact or potential impact. There will be times when a story could go either way, and in those moments, rolling traits will be the deciding factor. Naturally then, if the narrative is not at risk of significant change, no rolling is required. So what do I mean by that? Every trait that you have on your character sheet or on your GMC you know, data file or whatever you might have, those are a measure of how that thing can impact the narrative, that can impact the story that's going on. So this is why when sometimes folks will ask, well, how do I represent the fact that this person picks up a dagger? How do I represent the fact that this gun might run out of ammo? The answer is, do you need to? Because if you don't need to, then you can just say it. You can just say, oh, I busted open this door and I found a bunch of goblins and they all want to be my friend. Okay, you don't need dice for that. You can just say, I have friends. And then when you're doing stuff, you know, later on, and you're rolling dice or you're narrating whatever your character is doing, you can narrate that you have goblins helping you out or cheering you on or whatever. That's not a problem. But if you say, okay, I found some goblin friends and I want to make them have a significant impact on the story that we're all telling here, then that's when you can spend a plot point, make it a D6 asset and say goblin friends, or you can do a test created asset or something like that to represent them, to give them a quantifiable, like, boom, this is how much they are D6 worth of narrative impact. Okay, so you can always have them, but if you want to assign them something that's going to affect how the narrative goes one way or the other in those moments when the narrative goes one way or the other, then you can do that. But then, of course, the second piece of that is, if the narrative is not at risk of a significant change, no rolling is required. That just simply means if you want to, you know, if you're fighting, if you're having this battle, and then you say to your narrator, is there a sword? Did he have a sword? Can I grab his sword? Sure. Probably the answer is yes, you can grab the sword. Again, because it doesn't really affect, it's not really going to affect how the scene plays out. It's not really going to make a giant change one way or the other to sort of the momentum of the story that you're telling. Don't worry about a roll then. It's not really necessary. You certainly could, but it's not really necessary. So it's not really important to get that crunchy and that granular with assigning traits to everything. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing, that bedrock thing. The traits equals narrative impact, or die ratings equal narrative impact. All right, that's kind of the first bedrock piece. So then we move on from that. What the narrator chooses for sets and mods signals the ways available for the players to impact the narrative, right? So when a narrator chooses relationships as a prime set, for instance, they are specifically telling the players that relationships will be critical in how the narrative develops. So it's kind of like they're saying this in quotes, right? Role-playing can include references to all kinds of things, but in this story that we're telling right now, whenever the narrative is in flux and at a crossroads, and that's when you put things to a roll, one of the things that determines how it progresses is going to be relationships. So when you're looking at a character sheet, you know, it's kind of sort of an axiom that a character sheet, for some people, they consider it a wish list. Okay, sure, if that I am not going to argue with that, but understand that in a Cortex game, the blank character sheet The mods and the sets that a GM has chosen, that a narrator has chosen, that's sort of their wish list. Or it's not even a wish list as much as a requirements list, or maybe that's a little bit harsh, but it's essentially saying these are the things that are important. These are the things you need to be focused on, and if you want to play this game, you need to play characters that are focused on these things. So if we're playing a game like using relationships, for instance, but relationships are always an afterthought, or you're doing your character sheet, you're filling in the different blanks, and you leave relationships for the end, and you're like, I don't really have any, I don't have any strong feelings one way or the other. Can I just leave it empty? Now, yes, maybe you could. It depends on the game. I've done that before. Other GMs have done that before. That's fine. But you really need to ask yourself, if relationships is a prime set and you don't really have the gusto to fill them in, it's possible that this isn't the game that you're thinking it is. It may not be a good fit for you. Or there may have been some misunderstanding, or maybe something was misrepresented. Because if it's a prime set, it's critical to how that story is going to progress. And so you should be thinking about that sort of near the top of the things that you need to think through. So what the narrator chooses for sets and mods signals the way that are available for players to impact the narrative. Okay, so we've got the bedrock of the fact that die traits equals narrative impact, and then so naturally out of that we learn that the narrator is communicating to the players or potential players that these are the things that are going to matter, because those are the things that are going to impact the narrative. That's the kind of narrative we're telling. Okay, so then we get to the third piece there, and I'll scroll up a little bit, which is a really frequent question across all the socials. Magic. How do I do magic in Cortex? So think about the last things we just said, those 2 points. Magic, then, is just another way in which the narrative can be impacted. So the answer to the question, how do I do magic in Cortex, is going to ultimately be, how does magic, or how much does magic impact your narrative? If you're in Narnia, right, Chronicles of Narnia, or you're in Middle Earth, magic almost always takes a backseat to motivations or values or character or lore, things like that. They're there, but they're not front seat. They're not right there in every single beat of the story, right? But if you're talking Hogwarts or Arendelle or Eternia, magic features very prominently and frequently in those stories. So while the first one, the Narnia and Middle Earth, might be modeled easily enough through occasional signature assets or scene distinctions, the second one, the Hogwarts, Arendelle, Eternia, etc., those might actually warrant some trait sets that do relate to magic. So you wouldn't think of like necessarily having a sorcerer role in Narnia. There is a sorceress kind of, but it's not really a role that you would find. You don't find those kinds of people. That's not prominently, or that's not what people are primarily known for, even if they do have some magic going on. But in something like Eternia and Masters of the Universe, you absolutely would, and you would probably have signature assets and probably powers or abilities or something. Like, you would definitely have more to undergird that magic. So it goes back to that original point of those ratings are how you impact the narrative, and to the second point of the sets and mods being a signal to players that these are the things that are important. Then how do you represent magic in Cortex? You need to decide how important magic is to the story and how impactful you want it to be to the narrative. So when you're in that crossroads, when you're in that moment, things can go this way or that way, because remember, if that's not the situation you're in, there might not even be a role necessary. But if you're in that moment where things can go this way or that way and you decide there needs to be a role, if magic is always going to be a part, or largely going to be a part, frequently be a part of what decides which way it goes, then that's when you're going to want to have something that represents it a little better. If that's not always the case, if it's doing the backseat kind of stuff, then maybe it doesn't need to be represented so well. You can model lots of things lots of different ways, but this is sort of the theory, the scaffolding when I'm thinking through what I choose and how I present it and how I want things to flow, and how it looks player side versus on the narrator side and stuff. Okay, so that's kind of one sort of cohesive idea or set of ideas, all right? The next two pieces are kind of offshoots of that, connected but not directly in the same sphere. Cortex scenes are about something, so you have to keep that in mind when you're designing them and when you're designing corresponding GMCs. If the scene, for instance, is about a hero discovering their superpower, the GMC is really just a supporting cast. the takeaway of that scene isn't anything to do with the GMC. The point of the scene was to show that the hero has superpowers. An example I used recently on the Discord was in the first Jason Bourne film. He's on a park bench and some police officers come up to him and kind of are trying to get him to move, and he doesn't have his wallet or anything like that. And they make a move to get a little bit rough with him, and he kind of like automatically reaches and blocks. And there's this moment where the camera sort of zooms and pans, and you can see that realization coming onto him, and he does, his gun fu, kung fu, karate, matrix, whatever, and is able to disarm them and knock them out, and then leaves the scene. The point of that scene was not the fight. That had nothing to do with it. It doesn't matter who those people were. The point of that scene, the focus of that story beat, was to show that he has these sort of abilities that he didn't know about before. So if I, as the narrator, am trying to set a scene for a character, and the purpose of that scene is to get them to realize they have powers, I very well may not even give the officers in that case GMC cards. I might not even make them extras. It's probably just going to be a test. And to be honest, that's really only if I want it to be a this way or that way situation. If I know that I want the player to realize, or the character to realize, that they have these powers, if that's a foregone conclusion, I'm probably just going to narrate it. I'm going to say, you've got these officers coming up to you, what do you do? And I'm going to keep just storying back and forth, and we probably won't even go to a roll. Maybe if we want to make a little bit of a if there's a chance, if it's early on in the game and we want to build up hitches or something, there's those kind of under the hood decisions that sometimes go into that. But in terms of what the scene is about, it's not about combat. It's not about those GMCs, so it's not super necessary to bother giving them ratings, bother giving them data files, right? But continuing that paragraph, if the scene is about a hero avenging their family against the monster that transformed the family all into minnows, then the GMC, that was just a random example, right? The GMC is going to be more narratively significant, and so this is probably a moment that we're building up to and that we've been waiting for, and so on. So in the first case, it might be an extra with the officers, if they're even extras, but in that second case with the avenging and everything, you're probably talking about a boss or a major GMC, because they have a significant place in the story. So then representing them as such makes more sense. Okay, so that's the second piece, and then the third piece, also related to everything but not really in the same sphere, is growth mods. So growth mods likewise signal what ways a character will change over time. So whether it's accomplishing tasks, which would be like milestones, serial casting in sessions, which would just be session records, just the more times you play, or through challenging personal convictions, which would be like trait statements and the growth pool and stuff. Or maybe there's another, there's a lot of really creative folks out there, and I know there's mishmash versions of these in other ways. And to be honest, I've played games where I don't have a growth mechanism. I've played Marvel Heroic, on this channel even, where I just don't use milestones, because growth isn't important to the story that we're telling. And so that is kind of the second point about the narrator is signaling something to the players. What they would be signaling with the growth mod is, this is how your character is able to grow. So if, for instance, we are using the growth mod and we have trait statements on, let's say, values, and challenging those values is something which adds to the growth pool, right? Because that's part of how that works. Then if you are a player and you see that, you should be thinking to yourself, okay, what is expected of me, part of what is expected of me, is that I'm going to be challenging my values. So I need to know that ahead of time that I'm going to want to put my character in a position where they have to make that decision, and that conflict has to come through, and they challenge those values, because that's how they're going to grow. Now, you don't have to do that. You don't have to listen to any of these things. But if you want your character to grow over time, that's how they're going to do it. Whereas something like in Marvel Heroic or I don't think any of the three in the book use milestones, but to use Marvel Heroic as an example, the characters grow by accomplishing tasks, by succeeding in missions, which isn't always a personal journey. Sometimes it's more just the story, and then they spend the 10 XP to unlock something for that story, for that act or the event or whatever they happen to be going through. So it's not necessarily that they're going to spend the XP on making themselves stronger. They're spending the XP to now have a shield helicarrier that they can use for a scene, which matters in that story that they're telling, right? Okay, so that's my document. Those are the kinds of things that I think through when I'm making the choices as a narrator, or coming up with, you know, how does all this stuff work together? And this is by no means definitive, and by no means even like some expert level, you know, analysis or anything. Everyone is gonna have their own ways of doing things and presenting things, and I don't mean in any way to throw shade on anybody for that, but this is where I'm coming from. So this I wanted to do now, even though I've been working on it for several months. I wanted to do it now, riding off the back of the random hack generator videos, because the random hack videos are almost the opposite of this, right? Like, you're doing that, and then you have to think, okay, so what do these things tell the player? And if you remember, if you watched that video, I said at the end that the game was very casual and sort of lighthearted, because my sets, my attributes, what did I have? Attributes, roles, and distinctions, and resources, right? So I said this is pretty simple. This is not, there's no teeth here. You're not challenging trait statements. There's no like major, there's no motivations. There's no values, excuse me, or relationships. Although you certainly could add those things in, right? But without having those things, it's a very basic, very not bad, but straightforward presentation. So that would communicate to the players that the emphasis of the tension, the primary, like, whatever, I don't know a good word to say it, but it's going to rely a lot on role playing, whereas other games may not, because they've got those milestones. You know, milestones tell you how your character should probably act in a situation, or trait statements will tell you, they'll kind of guide your actions in a certain way, or relationships will tell you when you're acting with certain people how that dynamic works. There's none of those trappings on the dragon game. It's pretty straightforward. So you just have fun. You just have fun playing it, playing those dragon teens, doing you know, giant heists for their mother dragon. So doing that, and then coming and doing this video, it almost in a sense feels like the opposites of each other, but they work together. So if you're starting with nothing, this is, or if I should say, if I'm starting with nothing, this is where I start. You know, in terms of what do I want to communicate to players, what do I want the story to be about. If you're doing the random hack generator, then this kind of, or I should say, when I'm doing the random hack generator, and I will do that more often, I promise, I love doing that sort of thing. Then this is what I read after that. Like, I take the randomness and I say, okay, what does this mean? What does it mean that I have relationships? What does it mean that I have to use trait statements? What does it mean that I have to use hero dice? What does it mean that I have to do these things, right? Okay, that was a lot of talking, but I think I hit all my points that I wanted to make, and we read through the document. So if you have questions, let me know down in the comments below. And if you have, you know, tricks of the trade that you've learned that you want to share as well, then you can do that. And as always, you can join the Discord as well. We're always chatty over there about this sort of thing. Otherwise, that's all I will say for today. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Excelsior.